We still have some folks joining. But as we get into this topic, we always want to just thank you for your time. I certainly want to thank Edith, my dear colleague, for her time in preparation for this webinar. And just a couple of words about FRAC in case you're new. We are the Food Research and Action Center, and here is some information about what we do. I certainly couldn't be prouder to work for the nation's leading anti-hunger nonprofit organization doing research and advocacy, driving to eradicate poverty-related hunger in America. So if you haven't yet, please sign up for our newsletter, and you can find more information at our website listed there. Next slide, please. So thanks everyone for your time and interest in matters of disaster. And I'll focus on SNAP today. We'll touch on a couple of other nutrition programs very briefly, but we'll be focused on SNAP today. You know, it's been said, but I just think it's worth grounding ourselves that disasters really are the new normal. I know I was reading about some fires in Florida happening right now, and we'll certainly be talking and giving some examples of disasters that happened just recently in Kentucky. So we know that no matter where you are, what region, from earthquakes in Alaska to hurricanes and tropical storms in the southeastern part of the continental U.S., as well as the territories we'll be speaking about briefly, that communities are in greatest need, whether it's a natural disaster or even human caused, such as some of the power outages that I know are critical here in California and other areas. And just a couple of comments about that. I know we have some experts in the attendees joining us today, and so I hope that you're active with your questions and comments for Edith and myself. But just a couple of remarks as we get going. One is just to recognize that no two disasters are alike. And that's something that's very challenging for this area, but also provides a lot of collaborative learning and innovation opportunities. And so if we're saying something today that isn't exactly the experience in your state or your disasters, please lift that up in the comments in the webinar today, or to follow up with Edith and myself later. We're always trying to learn and inform future policy response. And the second, and Edith's going to get into this better than I can, but you know, these are situations in which low-income people in particular are on the front lines of these disasters. There's been a lot of work on climate justice, but no matter what, we know that people are in severe trauma during these situations, that their losses are occurring on a number of levels, including food, whether they've lost access to their home or lost it entirely, they've lost power, they don't have access to their kitchen, and they're just dealing with a variety of traumas. And I think that we need to have that trauma-informed perspective as we look to maximize nutrition assistance and minimize hunger following a disaster. Then just to say at the end here, we're really trying to emphasize, we'll come back to this theme, what you can do, some practical steps to reduce food insecurity before, during, and after. So it's never too soon to learn more and take action in this space. Next slide, please. Great, so what we're going to start off with are some provisions in the regular SNAP program and then move into what's called disaster SNAP. And so distinguishing between those two and understanding some of their potential interactions is really important. So first and foremost, under the regular SNAP program, and just to level set very briefly, this is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It may not be called SNAP in your state. For example, in California, it's called CalFresh. We'll use that term sort of interchangeably today, but it may have another name in your state. But it is the nation's largest anti-hunger and food access program. In 2021, more than 41 million Americans in an average month relied on it in getting an EBT card with benefits that can be redeemed at authorized retailers. And so for a household that is already connected to SNAP, they are always able to request replacement benefits following what's called a household misfortune. And so here we're seeing a map of a power outage that actually includes where I live here in the East Bay, in Richmond, California. That can be simply, you know, utility workers, you know, having an error, or it could be a storm and high winds knocking down a power line or something like that. And so that provision is always available to a SNAP household. Typically, if the power outage, for example, if it is a power outage, to use that example, if it's for more than 4 hours, there is recognition that there's been food loss. But there are certainly other types of household misfortunes that can happen. And so depending on the situation, up to 1 month of benefits can be replaced for that household. And one thing to think about is, depending on the situation, whether you're a place with a lot of storms or a lot of fire activity where the power is shut down, preemptively like it is here in California, there can be multiple household misfortunes within a month, and that can be very tricky to assist. And so it's very good for you to be thinking about your state's information on hand and be working with your state and potentially county administrators to be ready to share that information with your community. And I know later Edith will be covering some of the innovative ways California's been doing this, but it can be a challenging communication situation given that these can be temporary, they can be geographically isolated, and so having that information ahead of time can be really helpful for that individual level communication. Next slide, please. So in addition to that individual household replacement, there are additional provisions within SNAP that are important for you to track. And at the end, we'll be talking about resources that will go in much more depth. This is just an introductory presentation today. So there are several types of waivers that may be possible here. So the normal rules on reporting a household misfortune are 10 days. But if there is a large enough disaster, even before we get to disaster SNAP, but if there's a large enough situation, 10 days may not be long enough to communicate to households. There may be so many households bringing in these requests that the agency is overwhelmed and not able to process them. So there can be a waiver of that normal 10 days of timely reporting. There can be what's called mass replacement. So if, for example, just an example, if there's a power outage and the utility company has enough information on the geographic area, such as the zip code and the percent of households that lost the power is high, so we can sort of identify this area, then the state can request a replacement benefits for that section of the SNAP caseload. And that doesn't require any action by the household. It often uses a formula, and it's not the full month's replacement, so there are some trade-offs there, but oftentimes it's the simplest way to get the most benefits to the most households. So I encourage you to look up on that provision, as well as flexibility on several other areas of SNAP, such as types of verification required, waivers for certain populations, such as college students, employment and training requirements related to the work rules, as well as hot foods. Obviously, a typical situation during disasters and household misfortunes is folks lose their power or lose access to their kitchens. So allowing the purchase of hot foods that can be consumed immediately can be a critical point of food access for someone to even use their SNAP benefit. And again, that communication is really important, and we'll come back to this, but it's important for both the retailers and the consumers. And so we're seeing an example of that type of proactive communication because these are temporary provisions, right? And so getting the word out is very important. And the last thing that I would just say on this is, we're all a lot more familiar with these flexibilities, and they're not just in SNAP, right? There are similar flexibilities such as disaster household distributions in TFAP, waivers in the child nutrition programs, which is a hot topic I know a lot of you are engaged in right now, as well as WIC and other programs. And so just please be building on that knowledge and the evidence base through COVID that could be potentially utilized in a future disaster, a more traditional natural disaster. And then finally, just to remind that states are still required to take and process timely SNAP applications, including expedited service. And I know if you're in a county administered state, California has, for example, guidance on taking applications when someone has had to cross county lines in order to evacuate a certain situation. And so I encourage you to look up those rules and engage your states. Those are important topics. And just to be mindful that your administrators have been burdened by that disaster as well. It's important to remember that. And last and certainly not least, that if you have existing SNAP households, they may be eligible for increased benefits. They may have lost their income, for example, and eligible for a higher benefit. And so it's important to try and connect them to the benefits for which they're eligible. All right, next slide, please. So turning to disaster SNAP. It's important to understand that it is not always available, and it's only available under certain circumstances. And typically the route it happens is through the Stafford Act. And so this requires a presidential declaration of major disaster with individual assistance. And that's sort of a topic unto itself, but I think the key here is that the state actually has to request it. And so this really is around the understanding that the state has to say our emergency response capacity is overwhelmed and we need federal assistance. And so that request has to be made and it has to be granted by the president. And later I'll show a screenshot of the FEMA website. But I think it's important to understand that this is going to start with the Stafford Act and with FEMA. Less common, but still possible, is through the Food Stamp Act. And this requires an assessment that the normal commercial channels of food distribution have been disrupted and restored. I probably should have had on that on the slide here, and restored. And this can be very important, especially if you think about fires, but certainly I would think in other situations where there's been a lot of damage to infrastructure, because disaster SNAP is not a first responder. I know Edith is going to come back to this, but it's often the case with fires that there's a significant lag for even the assessments, let alone the safety for the grocery stores to be operating and for folks to come back and repopulate that area. And so that restoration of normal commercial channels can take quite a while. All right, next slide, please. So if disaster SNAP has been approved, here are some important things to know. Fundamentally, it is different than SNAP and is meant to run in parallel to SNAP. So it is not for SNAP households, and that's why earlier we talked about what you can do for SNAP households, or those who are eligible for SNAP. One important piece to be thinking about is that it is there for those who suffered losses where they live or where they work. And that employment loss has to be requested by the state, but has been approved in several cases, including California. Meaning that if there was a fire in Napa County and there was, destruction to a resort or a winery or a place of work like that, that someone who was working there, even if they don't live in that county, can be eligible. And that there are broader eligibility rules and streamlined applications in recognition of the disaster. So for example, you only have to verify your identity, and even that can be done through a collateral contact, a signed affidavit. Most types of information is only requires verification if questionable. There are still income and resource limits, but these are looser than regular SNAP. And some folks who would not be eligible for SNAP are eligible for disaster SNAP. But there can be a lot of confusion around this, and lots of folks will apply who are either already on SNAP or not eligible for DSNAP, and I'll leave those topics better in Edith's hands. But it's important to understand those rules and the parameters for potentially eligible populations. Okay, next slide, please. So again, so this is for households who are not currently on SNAP. They will receive typically 1 month of benefits. Although this has been extended during some of the hurricanes, so that is something that can be adjusted, but that's generally only in extraordinary circumstances, and typically a 1 week application window. And I would point out that application window, though, often has been extended from a few days to even months in the situation with Katrina and other hurricanes. And here's an example on the right from Kentucky from a recent flooding incident, where you can see that there were new counties added. And so it can be the length of time that's adjusted or the geographic area that's adjusted. And I know that this is happening in California as well. Again, those disaster assessments taking place by FEMA and by USDA and the state agencies, they're evolving. And so that can lead to very complicated communication challenges with the community around which areas are eligible during what periods of time. But it's important to know that those extensions are possible. All right, so I'm just going to go through quickly some actions that you can be taking. So next slide, please. So like I said earlier, and I'll come back to this again, it is not too soon to be preparing for disasters, including for disaster SNAP. One of the number one issues that FRAC has prioritized, and I know that there are folks who registered and maybe on the line here who've worked dearly on this, is to request a waiver of the in-person interview. I know I saw it firsthand in California, how just incredibly unbelievable it is to try and tell someone that even after they apply, they may have to drive across a county to show up in person. This was, pre-COVID, to present for an in-person interview. And so this has obviously been waived in SNAP generally for households during COVID, but for disaster SNAP, it's certainly a priority. And I appreciate the great work by Florida and others really leading the way on this, as well as to shift eligible households from disaster SNAP to SNAP. And that obviously, it takes time and it's not easy work, but that can really help ensure that households don't just get 1 month of benefits, but can transition onto SNAP, presuming they're eligible, and can remain connected to the program. And just to acknowledge that, again, when we're thinking about the administration of the program. This is very challenging for administrators. They may have lost their homes or have had to evacuate in hardships too. And so starting those conversations early with your states and your administrators is really important. So here's some ways to do that. Next slide, please. So there are several required plans that offer you points of action and opportunity. So if you're not already in touch with your regional office, they have to have a disaster plan, which is reviewed by headquarters. This covers things like lines of authority, current contacts, and conducting an annual disaster training meeting for program officials in the states, or at least having annual check-ins regarding readiness. And there's obviously lots of states that are active nearly every year. And so there may be important learnings and opportunities to update plans with those lessons. States have to have an annual disaster plan approved by August 15th. So your state may already be working on that. And it could be a great opportunity to be connecting with them around definitions of responsibilities, their contact information, their procedures for informing the public, ways to streamline applications, training caseworkers and issuing benefits. Lots of things go into state plans. And also opportunities to coordinate with emergency food providers. If you're from that area of the anti-hunger community, you may be working with voluntary organizations active during disasters, or VOEDs, or your state or county may have an emergency food task force. Making sure those entities are coordinated, making sure they're planning for maximizing the federal nutrition programs and what may be happening on the emergency food side through mass care and shelter or through food banks, very important. And I would point you to the fact that USDA has a disaster SNAP handbook for states. So you may get some important tips there. All right, just a couple slides and I'll wrap up. I'm not going to go through the next one, but you can, this is from FRAC's, oh, go back one, please. This is from FRAC's Advocates Guide. You can see that number one, starting with before disaster strikes, develop those relationships, dig into some of those plans, all the way through number 10, do a post assessment. And I know Edith's going to talk about that a little bit. So just to think about that continuous cycle of improvement and some opportunities for state action. If your state is one, on the next slide, please. If your state is a place where you might pass legislation, this is an area where I know California Association of Food Banks, during my time there in Western Center on Law and Poverty, passed legislation that required some of that planning to be done to include disaster SNAP outreach based on feedback that we'd gotten from Edith and their team. So really be working hand in glove with your SNAP outreach and other assisters who can be informing ways to improve the execution of those plans. And I would add on a federal opportunity for action is parity for Puerto Rico and some of the territories where SNAP doesn't exist. They don't have the disaster SNAP response and have required special appropriations. So if that's something you're interested, you can contact me after the webinar. Okay, so where can you learn more? Again, so you should be tracking where FEMA is making disaster declarations. This is where you can, if you're working with your state on making that request for a presidential major disaster with individual assistance, FEMA will have information on where those come through. And then you can see once that happens, and then once the disaster SNAP plans are submitted and approved, USDA will update information. So there are multiple places to be tracking that. And I'd be glad to follow up with anyone for more information. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Edith, who has just a wealth of information about what this looks like in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. My name is Edith, and I work at the California Association of Food Banks, and my role is to support our partner nonprofits who apply for and stay on SNAP. And so today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about our experience in mobilizing a disaster SNAP outreach effort and kind of what we learned. This is a picture of Coffee Park in Santa Rosa, and it's the first disaster response that I participated in during the wildfires of 2017, which at the time were like one of the most destructive wildfire seasons on record in California. And so we knew that we might have to kind of begin to mobilize for disaster SNAP, and so we immediately started preparing. Next slide, please. So we started communicating with the local food bank, the state SNAP administration office, SNAP advocates, and the SNAP outreach network. Some of my colleagues also started working with retailers about the availability of a hot foods waiver, and we really also relied heavily on our SNAP outreach network for volunteers to come help us and spread the word. And we started preparing training materials for our SNAP outreach network, who are going to come out and help us with this effort. So we really wanted to make sure that partners knew about the options available for people on SNAP, but then also about disaster SNAP and the rules around it as its own program. We also started drafting talking points in English and Spanish, and we started gathering supplies for like a physical in-person outreach effort, so things like flyers and maps and other supplies. And I also want to acknowledge that we've been living in a pandemic, and so things have changed. And so what I'm sharing with you are things that we did before, but I'm hopeful that it'll still kind of help you prepare. Next slide, please. And so this is a picture of our morning huddle. As Andrew mentioned, disaster SNAP applications are only accepted for a week. So we had 1 week to get the word out to reach as many people as we could. And every day we kind of followed the same format. We started with the morning huddle, then we went out and did outreach in pairs, and then we ended up the day back together to debrief on what had happened during the day. We used this morning time to do training scenarios and talk about strategy, and then also divide out into outreach assignments. Next slide, please. Practicing scenarios was really a crucial component, and training was a crucial component because we did have new volunteers each day, and it also allowed us to really kind of warm up and practice talking about disaster SNAP, as well as the options for people on SNAP. And so aside from talking about disaster SNAP and the benefit in the application process, we also practice addressing like skepticism and concerns, or approaching businesses and asking them to help us not only inform their employers and their employees and their clients, but also their family and friends. Next slide, please. In terms of the strategy for where we conducted our outreach, we really kind of relied heavily on the knowledge and expertise of the local staff. Sometimes we broke up based on kind of geographic locations, other times it was based on sector. And then I really kind of want to emphasize that, you know, as a SNAP outreach providers and talking about SNAP, we're used to thinking about schools and places of worship and clinics and things like that. But during a disaster, we really kind of have to challenge and extend our outreach to other non-traditional locations like large employers or the Chamber of Commerce, and people that are reaching anyone who was impacted by the natural disaster, really. And then one other really key component of the mobilization was that we had a contact person who stayed at home at all times and at home base, and they answered questions and issues that came up. And so they were providing technical assistance, but also coordinating media requests and ordering flyers and staying in contact with the state and local county offices, which was also really super important. Because when the county office shared that they were short on Spanish interpreters, we were then able to respond quickly and send volunteers to also help at the county office with the Spanish interpreting. This is a picture of our evening team huddle, which was when we would share kind of what went well, what challenges we encountered, and kind of start a plan for the next day. And I also want to mention that it was an important opportunity for us to kind of reflect individually on what our day had been like and to share our experiences. And that was super important because talking to people who've been through a natural disaster is like really quite hard, and it can take an emotional toll on your well-being. And so we really wanted to make sure that we had the space for people to debrief and talk about their experiences and just kind of connect with other people as part of self-care and taking care of ourselves during this work too. Next slide, please. Some of the challenges in doing this work is, of course, the 1 week application window that you're kind of working against. And so we saw enrollment start slow and increase during the week, peaking closest to the deadline. And so that made it really important for SNAP offices to extend their office hours and to inform the public of the extended hours as well. And then, of course, another big challenge is that we have this great program, the Disaster SNAP program, whose the goal is to help people meet their food needs after a natural disaster, but also people may not necessarily know it, and or people who are eligible may not necessarily be familiar with public benefits. And so it's definitely challenging to have 1 week to kind of reach and inform people. And again, really having to be creative about your outreach strategies and thinking of outside of not just typical SNAP outreach locations, but other people who we may not otherwise normally work with. And also just definitely the need for an in-person office interview is just a huge challenge. I mean, we spoke to people who did not have transportation to go to the nearest office. The nearest office were quite far. And also there was people who we knew had relocated to other counties as well as even out of state. And so the in-person interview really kind of became an impossible barrier to overcome in those situations. Next slide, please. So once the application window closed, we did have a debrief with outreach workers and stakeholders, and some of the things that people mentioned was that they liked the outreach packets that we put together, including talking points and all the materials they had, and that they really felt that wearing their SNAP shirts and logo gear was really helpful in easing concerns about scam or fraud and kind of just gaining validity and credibility within the community. We also had a flyer with tear-off information that was well received. And then I also want to mention that we were able to also conduct other similar disaster SNAP outreach activities that same year with less people by really utilizing and relying on remote support to help us get information posted on websites and Facebook groups and social medias, as well as following up with people via email while the smaller team kind of worked on the ground and met with people face to face. Next slide, please. We got some feedback on messaging. Originally, our state flyer used the words disaster food in describing disaster SNAP, and so the public wasn't quite sure what that meant. They weren't sure if we were giving away groceries or if it meant prepared meals, and of course, disaster SNAP is neither of those. So we ended up describing it more as like an emergency food benefit that's available after natural disasters. And then we also got feedback that we needed to be more specific about in speaking about who was eligible. So we were saying that it was for people who were impacted by the wildfires, but we needed to take it a step further to really kind of help people self-identify with what we meant by impacted. So in the future, we may want to ask questions like, did you evacuate or did you have to throw away food? Next slide, please. And then a few other considerations for things we'd like to see in the future. For sure, as Andrew mentioned, mass replacement being incredibly important because we know that communicating with and reaching individual households is a challenge. I've linked here the California website where people can request individual replacement. And then definitely working with and informing key stakeholders ahead of time because we, again, only have 1 week for applications. And then we also like to see kind of planning about stationing of eligibility workers because we know that not everyone can get into the county office, and similarly extended office hours that can be publicized from the very beginning and start of the application period, and kind of expecting that the week will naturally ramp up with more applications towards the end. Next slide, please. And then a few other considerations, things like, of course, waiving the in-person interview whenever possible. We'd also like to see a strategy to address the diverse language needs and that the offices, the SNAP offices are prepared. And of course, also a main website with an easy URL for the public to access information, a site that can be kind of free of jargon and with like a really clear, simple call to action. Along those lines, we'd also like to see kind of a social media toolkit that uses like the right hashtags for that specific disaster and that coordinates with other disaster response agencies. And then, of course, we'd also love to hear from SNAP participants directly in the form of like focus groups or other feedback. And then along with, of course, continuing to debrief and document and provide feedback to your state SNAP administrators to really improve the program and the experience. Next slide, and I think that's kind of the end. We have a few resources listed here, but do please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and happy to share training materials, scenarios, or help brainstorm and kind of just work together and making sure that we're all prepared. Thank you.
Thank you, Edith. Yeah, just a shout out to the great resources by California Association of Food Banks and that replacement benefits website. That may be something you want to pursue with your state, something simplified for folks to have. Then you also have something like a stable URL to use from in other replacement scenarios. And then in terms of FRAC's resources, there is the Advocates Guide. So thanks to SNAP's director, FRAC SNAP Director Ellen Bollinger, and Hunger Fellows and other FRAC staff who put that together. And then in terms of the FRAC chats, just to really underscore the first one that Ellen Bollinger authored, it covers remarks by President Biden in trying to set the tone that across programs, including nutrition assistance, that those Americans suffering from disasters should be connected to all the benefits for which they're eligible. We think that's helpful, as well as some of the FRAC chats also lift up that disaster SNAP was not a tool that was used during the pandemic, but could have. And there actually is a prescient section in the Advocates Guide that talks about in 2018, a future pandemic, and how disaster SNAP could have been used. So I just wanted to point that out, as well as obviously please get a hold of Edith and myself. Edith, we got a question in the chat that I might be misinterpreting, so I want to kick it to you because I think that California's been through this, unless I'm misunderstanding it. The question is around, we've consistently had only 5-day reporting requirements for our DSNAP authorizations. We find it hard to get the word out in that short period of time about the application. Is there a threshold states need to show how to get a waiver to extend the 5-day reporting requirement to 10 days or longer, or push the state? It seems like this is a question more about extending that application window than the reporting requirement, but I could be misunderstanding. And I know that that's been an issue in California to try and get more than 7 days, or maybe 5 days in other states, to have folks to apply for disaster SNAP.
Yeah, I'm not understanding if the question is about extending the application period, which I think you can do, especially if there's been an issue. Or also about an opportunity to extend reporting, which again,
I just got confirmation over the chat. It is the application window. So I can maybe take a stab, or unless I think maybe you've been involved too in what it looks like to extend the application window when you have evidence that the initial 5 or 7 days has not been long enough.
I haven't. Go for it, Andrew.
Sorry. Okay, all right. Okay, cool. I just wanted to offer you the chance. So I think this speaks to a lot of the points that Edith made around having regular debriefs, like daily debriefs with the those folks doing application assistance, the folks in the field, as well as frequent as possible. I know at times they're daily in California. Debriefs in terms of feedback loops with, if you're county administered, your county and state in your regional office, or at least your state in your regional office. It's by no means a guarantee, but that can help build the evidence base. I know in California, sometimes it's only been a few days, but if the last day of the week has been a Friday, for example, if you're seeing the applications come up, I think you can help make the case that the word is just getting out, and that there is need to extend the application window for a certain period of time to allow for all of the folks who are finally getting the word to be able to apply. Or there may be evidence that because again, your administrators are going to be burdened as well. They may have their own sort of internal data of how long it's taking them to process the applications, and that they're not able to fully process them all with an application window, and they need more time as well. So I don't think that there's any one standard, but working with your administrators and your sister community to really figure out, do you have a case to be made, and then try and make it as quickly and proactively as possible, can be helpful. And we're glad to follow up with anyone with more information about that. And thank you, Stephanie, for even going into that. Again, it's sort of like a hurry up and wait situation sometimes, where you do all this work, and then it still takes however many weeks or how long it is for disasters to happen, but then all of a sudden it's this rush of 7 days potentially. And so I appreciate Stephanie's point on even being ready going into day one with that messaging, to try and get the word out as fast as possible, but to sort of know going in that time is going to go by very quickly, and to be prepared with conversations around how's it going almost immediately, to try and assess whether an extension is warranted, and pursue that, knowing how quickly that has to happen. And all the more reason to be building constructive and deep relationships with your administrators at all levels to facilitate those conversations. All right, that's all the time we have for today. We are going to save the chat and get back to any other questions. We are going to make the deck available, as well as post this on FRAC's YouTube channel. Thank you so much, everyone who joined. Sincere thanks to Edith for your time and all this great information. And please be proactive. Reach out to Edith or myself with more questions, ideas. Certainly when we think about opportunities at the state or even the federal level, we want to strengthen disaster SNAP to make it work as well as possible. just to end on a high note, as horrible as these situations are for communities, it's just critical that this provision is there. We've seen, particularly in the Southeast with the hurricanes, how many folks have come on to disaster SNAP. And so we just want to continue to strengthen this provision and make sure people have food assistance when they need it most. Thank you so much.